Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue à cette 75e réunion du Comité permanent des langues officielles. Comme vous avez pu voir, ce n'est pas le président régulier qui est en place, mais bien son premier vice-président. Alors, j'aurai le plaisir de présider cette réunion-là et je vous demande à l'avance votre indulgence. Comme vous êtes des habitués, je n'aurai pas à faire la lecture à moins que vous l'exigiez. J'aimerais tout simplement rappeler un élément qui est bien important. Bien que cette salle soit munie d'un système audio performant, il est possible que des retours de son se produisent. Ceux-ci peuvent être extrêmement nocifs pour les interprètes et leur causer de graves blessures. La cause la plus fréquente d'un retour de son est une oreillette portée trop proche d'un microphone. Nous demandons donc à tous les participants de faire preuve d'une grande prudence lors de manipulation des oreillettes, surtout lorsque votre micro ou celui de votre voisin est allumé. Afin de prévenir les incidents et sauvegarder la santé auditive de nos interprètes, si précieux pour nous, j'invite les participants à s'assurer qu'ils parlent bien dans leur microphone assigné et d'éviter de manipuler les oreillettes en les déposant sur la table loin du micro lorsqu'ils ne sont pas en utilisation. Je vous remercie de porter une attention à cet avis et je souhaite la bienvenue. Non, M. Lauzon n'est pas là pour l'instant. Ah, M. Lauzon, il vient de se joindre à nous. M. Lauzon, bienvenue au comité. Je ne le vois pas, moi. Bienvenue au comité des langues. Je sais que vous n'êtes pas un membre régulier, mais nous sommes heureux de compter sur votre présence aujourd'hui. On fera votre test de son un peu plus tard. S'il y a un problème, on fera une interruption pour faire les tests de son. Alors, voilà, nous sommes rendus suite à une motion qui a été déposée. Nous avons le plaisir d'avoir... J'ai pas le titre de M. Quell.
C'est sur le papier. Deuxième page.
Deuxième page. Merci de votre indulgence, comme je le disais. Alors, j'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue en premier lieu à l'honorable Anita Anand, présidente du Conseil du Trésor, et M. Karsten Quell, directeur exécutif, Centre d'excellence en langues officielles, bureau de la dirigeante principale des ressources humaines. Alors, bienvenue à vous deux. Madame Anand, à vous la parole pour 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Avant de commencer, je reconnais qu'on est situé sur le territoire non cédé de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe. Je suis accompagnée, comme vous avez dit aujourd'hui, de Karsten Quell, directeur exécutif au Centre d'excellence en langue officielle. Et je suis ravie de me présenter devant ce comité pour la première fois en tant que présidente du Conseil du Trésor. Je tiens à souligner le travail important de ce comité dans la défense des langues officielles et à vous remercier pour votre examen approfondi du projet de loi C13. Le bilinguisme a toujours été une priorité pour moi depuis ma jeunesse. Je suis née à Kentville, en Nouvelle-Écosse, et mes parents ont immigré de l'Inde. Mes parents ne parlaient pas le français, mais ils ont assuré à ce que j'apprenne à parler et communiquer dans les 2 langues officielles. Pas mes sœurs, seulement moi, je ne sais pas pourquoi. J'ai suivi des cours d'immersion en français, j'ai appris la langue à l'école. En tant que ministre fédéral, être capable de parler dans les 2 langues officielles n'est pas seulement une bonne chose à faire, c'est une responsabilité que nous prenons tous très au sérieux. Mes fonctionnaires, comme Karsten ici avec moi, savent qu'ils ont toujours le choix de m'envoyer des documents en français ou d'avoir les sessions de briefage dans la langue française. Ce n'est qu'une des raisons pour lesquelles je dirai toujours à mon personnel, à mes fonctionnaires et à mes collègues francophones que nous pouvons communiquer en français si c'est ce qu'ils préfèrent. Monsieur le Président, l'un des aspects les plus importants de mon mandat est de garantir un droit fondamental à toutes les Canadiennes et à tous les Canadiens, celui de recevoir des services des institutions fédérales dans la langue officielle de leur choix. Comme vous le savez, Monsieur le Président, la loi modernisée élargit le rôle du Conseil pour y inclure
of the board to include overseeing support for the vitality of English and French-speaking minority communities, the promotion of both official languages in Canadian society, and the protection and promotion of the French language. It also gives me, as President of the Treasury Board, a greater leadership role in governing and implementing official languages policy. The Modernize Act also strengthens bilingual leadership in the public service. Deputy ministers and associate deputy ministers in federal departments will now be required to take language training, unless they are already bilingual, to ensure that they are able to speak and understand both official languages. Finally, Mr. Chair, I would like to point out that my department is also in the process of developing regulations that will provide us with a framework to ensure that we comply with these sections of the Act. I'll be working on this with Minister Boissonnault and involving all stakeholders. This work is a priority. But these are important regulations that will require extensive consultations. So we will take the time necessary to get the job done right. There's no doubt in my mind that since I was young, speaking French has been extremely important to me, and I put that feeling to work every day. My team and I would be delighted to answer any questions you may have. Thank you for your interest. Thank you, Madam Minister. First of all, I would like to congratulate you on your French and thank your parents for the efforts that they have made. Madam Minister, given the fact that I am the chair, I would ask for unanimous consent to remain in my spot and to take my 6 minutes as representative of the Conservative Party of Canada to ask questions. Any objections? Mr. Serrier, is that okay? If no, I will move. Thank you to everyone. So, Madam Minister, I'll play the role of the interviewer, but be assured of my impartiality. And now my 6 minutes has started. Madam Minister, I would like to know, the Parliamentary Budget Officer said that it requires a lot of money for you to implement the Act that came into effect on official languages in June. Will you hire a consultants to see how you can eliminate a number of consultants in the government cogs to save money? Well, two things. First of all, we have to review spending, and that's for $15 billion, but that is not the same thing as financial support for official languages. Yes, I understand that you are going to find the necessary funding and you don't need to consult externally to find the necessary money to apply the Act. It's certain that, thank you, it is certain that we have the money for official languages. The PBO is not saying the same thing, but we'll take your word for it. Do you think that the demographic weight of Francophones in Canada is declining? At the same time, my responsibility is to implement the parts of the Act for Anglophones and Francophones, and that is the role. Ms. Anand, I'm sorry. You'll understand that I'm limited in my time. My question is simple. Do you feel that the demographic weight of Francophones in Canada is declining? Yes or no? I am talking about my responsibilities, and you don't want to weigh in on that? The case for me is to support both official languages, but I have nothing to do with what happens to both languages. That is your answer, and I respect your answer. Second question, is the demographic weight of Francophones in Quebec declining. Is that the same answer? I have the responsibility for both official languages in Quebec and outside of Quebec. That is the work that I need to do as president of the Treasury Board. You were appointed last July. Have you met members of official language minority communities? I will continue to work. No, my question, Madame Anand, since July, since your appointment to the position of President of the Treasury Board, have you met with organizations from official language minority communities? Yes or no? I met the Commissioner of Official Languages, of course, and I speak with officials throughout. They are the stakeholders, but you personally have not met with OLMCs. I spoke with Anglophone and Francophone officials to understand their needs. Thank you, Ms. Anand. My question was simple, and I think that the answer can be deduced from your response. Are you responsible for protecting the status of French and English outside of Quebec? I have the responsibility to ensure that we have bilingual services for all Canadians. But Ms. Anand, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Madame Anand. Yes, and I'm sorry, but I'm sorry to interrupt you. My question, I will ask it differently. Is there an urgency to act to prevent the decline of French across Canada, including in Quebec? Simple question. We have a bill C-13, and yes, I think it's not a bill. It's an act now. It is legislation now. Point of order, Mr. Chair. Yes. Mr. Iachino. Thank you. I understand that you want to have answers to your questions, but you need to give the witness the chance to answer the question regardless of whether the beginning of her response doesn't please you. I think that you are continuing to ask questions over and over again because you don't like the way she's answering. I'm sorry, I hadn't finished, Mr. Chair. So out of politeness, I think that since you are occupying the role of chair and you should understand that you need to give a chance to the witness, and if she answered a question, you cannot add to her answer or why she answered in such a way. Her answer stands for itself, and you cannot make comments on it or suggest why she answered in such a way. I think that you are exceeding your jurisdiction in asking questions in that way. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Iachino. You have made those comments and interpreted my questions, and that is, you are free to do so. I will continue. I will resume my time. Last chance to answer to that question. Is there an urgency to act on the decline of French in Canada and in Quebec? Yes, of course. What are the powers of the Minister of Official Languages in the current legislation? To encourage the promotion of the equality of English and French in Canada, and also to cooperate to develop a pan-governmental strategy on official languages with my colleagues. Thank you, Ms. Anand. Last question for me. Your government has committed to table a white book in which was written very clearly to table a bill on C-21, to table a second bill to impose time allocation to pass it as quickly as possible. How do you say that you can support OLMCs when you say that when this won't be supported, this won't be passed for another 2 or 3 years before the Standing Senate Committee? Mr. Chair, it's difficult for the interpreters to interpret at that speed. Madam Anand, what did you understand? We are continuing to implement C-13, of course. The regulations and the framework are part of the Act, but that means that they're another thing that we will do in addition to implementing Bill C-13. Point of order. You're over your 6 minutes, Mr. Chair. Mr. Serre, the clerk's watch doesn't tell me that I've gone over my 6 minutes. Madame Anand, there are 3 ministerial decrees that need to be voted on to ensure that the bill is applicable. The power of the commissioner on immigration, and also the third escapes me, but there are 3 ministerial orders, and the minister told us that he didn't know when it would be done, and I would like to know who will make the decision to table. Point of order, Mr. Chair, this is well over 6 minutes. Thank you. Mr. Serre, I am the chair. I have a clock, and my 6 minutes have not lapsed because I stopped the clock during these interventions. Point of order, there you had 20 seconds earlier. And we gave unanimous consent to ask questions for 6 minutes, and you did so, Mr. Chair. So now we need to move on to the second speaker. Mr. Serre, Mr. Beaulieu. Well, there were points of order, and Madam Clerk, can you tell us how much time he has remaining? Go ahead, Madam Clerk. I have 5 minutes and 57 seconds, so he hasn't finished his 6 minutes. Okay, he has 3 seconds left. So, Madam Minister, I will reformulate my question because I was interrupted. I would like to know when the government will table the orders and vote on them to allow the Act to be fully applied. Most of the provisions of the Modernized Act came into effect on royal assent, and we will continue to implement C-13. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but my time for questioning is over. We will continue. If you wish to complete with another, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Mr. Sanson.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Madam President. I'm very happy to see you here. And also the fact that you come from the cradle of Acadia, Nova Scotia, like myself, so it's very much appreciated. And your comments at the outset were very much appreciated when you were suggesting that people should choose the language of their choice to speak with you. I'll always speak in French, and you always answer me in French. And that's always been the case since you were elected. So thank you very much for that as well. Now, you've made a point that I'd like to check to see whether I've correctly understood. You've asked your deputy ministers to learn French, or were these already criteria that were established beforehand?
C'est dans la loi.
It is in the Act, of course, and I'd like to explain the situation and the provisions. First of all, it is the responsibility of each deputy minister to ensure that they are in compliance with the Treasury Board directive. And I also understand that everyone has to respect these directives or instructions, and each department has to comply with the law. And each deputy minister has to ensure that the department adheres to the Act. So there's a leadership role there in terms of the 2 official languages, including French, of course. And we know that 96% of the positions are now bilingual. So that means
are staffed by people who have met the requirements for bilingualism, mais le travail continue.
But the work continues. We have to continue to support the 2 official languages within our public service with the officials, the public servants. But we know that we've got the Act that was required to do that. I also understand that this committee has studied C-13 and has supported this Act as well. That's very good. Thank you, Minister. And I love the fact that the Treasury Board is responsible for oversight for this, is because it's the board that has expertise in the oversight of bills, projects, and so on. And part of this oversight function is, of course, to assess the various departments. about 6 or 7 years ago, I put a question on this to see how the Treasury Board today and in your role, how can you actually evaluate whether the work under C13 and compliance with C13 is being followed in all departments. For example, there was a report that comes out annually from various departments, and in fact is provided to you every 3 years, this review. The members were very disappointed in the past because it was a kind of self-assessment that was carried out by the departments in question themselves. So how can we make sure that the work is going to be done so that it's not just self-assessment that comes from the departments themselves? First of all, each year we have an annual report where we can see the progress that has been made and what we need to do to continue to improve the situation and increase what's happening with the 2 official languages. We also have a framework or an infrastructure, if you like, together with Mr. Quell's office, the Centre of Excellence for the 2 official languages. That's a second point. Then thirdly, we also have the Commissioner who actually monitors the situation, continues to support the official languages, and he can take action if there is non-compliance with the Official Languages Act. I've met with the Commissioner of Official Languages, and he said that he's taking C13 very seriously. We are going to collaborate. We're going to work together to make sure that we have the right environment, not just for the Act, but to ensure that everyone can work in the language of their choice. How much time have we got left, sir? 1 minute 15. Very good. That way, Mr. Seri knows as well. Yes, Madam President, Madam Minister, we had the RCMP here 2 weeks ago, and no doubt you've seen that there were positions that were designated as bilingual, but they weren't being filled by people who actually were bilingual. And I asked them, or I made a suggestion, and he said that's what he was going to implement. But I would like to have your comments on all of this, because he said that there's 2 distinctions. There's the bilingual position on the one hand, and then there's a question of safety/security that has to be taken into account as well. So my suggestion to him was that if you find the person who is not bilingual, but because of safety considerations, you have to put them into a position in the short term, can we not have a system where the position is then not permanent, it remains temp until this person can take courses and manage in the other language, or else until we find someone who actually meets this criterion of being bilingual? I'm afraid that's the end of your time allocation, but allow Madam Annan to give a brief answer, but the 6 minutes is actually up. Over to you, Madam President. There is the possibility in the Act for me as Minister President of the Treasury Board to take measures to ensure that public servants can actually comply with the Act, namely to have informal follow-ups, or requests for information, or also for external audit purposes. So there are certain measures that we can take. Thank you very much, Ms. Anand. And now the second Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Mario Beaulieu. Thank you, and good afternoon, Madam Annan. Thank you to the 2 witnesses for being here. I'm going to continue on from Mr. Gaudin. Do you recognize that French is in decline in Quebec? And what indicators do you base that on? I have the responsibility to implement C13, and to support the 2 official languages, not just in Quebec, but throughout Canada. But you're not answering my question. Perhaps you don't know. For example, I can tell you about the proportion of residents in Quebec who mainly speak French at home. It's a drop by 79% to 77.5%. 77%. These are statistics from Statistics Canada. So can you admit that there has been a decline in French? It is the responsibility of the President of the Treasury Board to support both languages in the province of Quebec and everywhere else in our country. That means that, of course, it's urgent to continue to work with everyone in our country. So you're not prepared to recognise that there has been a decline in French, but you're ready and prepared to recognise that the federal government does have a responsibility to protect French in Quebec. Is that it? But do you understand that this is rather worrisome? Because since 2020, the Liberals, or the former official languages minister, repeat that we're the first government to recognise the decline of French, etc. And C13 has been amended to admit that we have to also protect French in Quebec. But it seems that several Liberals do not recognise the decline of French. There's one Minister of Immigration who has recognised the decline in terms of being used as a mother tongue, and the Official Languages Minister seems to acknowledge this decline when we look at all the indicators, because whether it's the first official language that's spoken or the language work, all the indicators point to the fact there's a decline in French in Quebec and in Canada. So if you don't acknowledge that, that is a cause for concern. But I'd like to know something. You're also responsible for monitoring follow-up and to give instructions. The Treasury Board has an important role to play when it comes to Part 7 of the Official Languages Act. So which measures are going to be undertaken to protect French in Quebec? First of all, I'd like to answer by saying that we support the Quebec government. And we have invested in Quebec to support their immigration plan. No, here I'm talking about the official languages programs, please. If I could please continue, sir. In 2022, the federal government reached its target of 4.4% of Francophone immigration for the first time. Please answer my question. I'm asking you which measures you think are aimed at protecting French in Quebec within the action plan on official languages and subsidies and various support programs for the two official languages. Yes, for example, federal offices that are close to a school, that's one example of the official language. Minorities communities will always be bilingual, and the federal offices will continue to be bilingual, even if the minority community goes down in proportion to the majority language community on this territory. So there are certain provisions in the Act to ensure that we give support if there's that type of situation. Now, in the action plan, official languages, one of your mandates is to monitor the implementation of that and come up with recommendations on that matter. We've talked about 137 new projects. I believe it's 137.5 million in terms of new projects, rather, corrects the speaker. So what is the proportion that's going to be used to support French out of that 137.5 million? So that falls under the remit of my colleague, Minister Boissonnault. I believe that he's already come before you to answer these questions. As far as I am concerned, I am the President of the Treasury Board. I am responsible for the public service and public servants and infrastructure and officials throughout this country, and I can answer questions on that subject. Okay. Well, you said in the meeting with the Senate, and we've also seen in the media, that you're working to develop regulations under Part 7, but you're talking about 2025, 2026 before these come out. Now, in these regulations, over the last 53 years, the funding for official languages in Quebec has basically supported English, and that's one of the main reasons for the decline of French in Quebec. So is something going to change now on that front? If I could perhaps clarify something with the deadline, the timing that you mentioned. There are two matters here. First of all, there's the framework and then also the regulations. The framework is going to be released, delivered within 6 to 9 months' time. And for the regulations, it'll be 2 or 3 years. Why? Because, well, unfortunately, I have to interrupt because the 6 minutes are already up. I have to be the timekeeper here. Perhaps you can add if somebody else puts the same sort of question on that. But now we're going to go on to our MP from Manitoba, Ms. Ashton. Over to you for 6 minutes, please. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to welcome the Minister. First of all, we know that the Treasury Board has new obligations in terms of official languages. So on that matter, have you already taken the opportunity to meet with representatives from official language minorities communities? And more specifically, have you already met with the Federation of Francophone and Acadian Communities of Canada and the QCGN Quebec Community Groups Network? Well, myself and my team talk with many people throughout our country, and I will be meeting with other leaders and other organizations in our country. I take very seriously my responsibilities under this Act. C-13, I really like French. I like both official languages a great deal, in particular in the province in which I was born. So, of course, I will be meeting with Acadians as well. And more exactly, the SCFA is the main association that represents Francophone communities outside of Quebec. They're the ones who've worked hard on the modernisation of the Official Languages Act, and that is one of the main ways that we can guide the work that you will have to accomplish under the Act C-13. So when are you planning to meet with this association, the FCFA, and also the QCGN? Thank you for that question. We have regular contacts with representatives from official language minorities communities. For example, 2 weeks ago, well, no, the question was, when are you planning to hold these meetings, formal meetings, to meet with the leadership of the FCFA? Do you have a window as soon as possible that you're going to meet with them? Yes, as soon as possible. I know that my office is in contact with this group, and we are trying to set a meeting as soon as possible. Okay, thank you for that. That's rather disappointing that you haven't had a formal meeting yet with these organizations, as they're the ones who can actually guide you in the next steps to come. Speaking from the experience on the ground. And then Francophone communities want to have a deadline of 18 months for adopting regulations on the new Official Languages Act. When do you think we're going to actually get these regulations that flow from C-13, particularly the regulation under Part 7, which deals with positive measures to support the development of official language minorities communities? Well, if I could explain this, because I haven't had the opportunity to finish my thinking on this. We have a process surrounding the regulations. First of all, we have to hold consultations with the various stakeholders involved. After that, there's a process that has to be followed. We have to go before the Senate and before our own House of Commons as well. So it is not easy to guarantee that we will able to move forward with this act and get it through the Senate and the House of Commons as quickly as possible, because there's a process that has to be followed. We have to take the time to make sure that we are going to have the correct regulations that we need to actually underpin C13. That is what I'm going to do together with my team. Are you aware of the fact that certain organizations are concerned that the timeline that you've shared to the Senate, talking about 3 years and perhaps more, is not actually acceptable for the communities? They want this work to be done within 18 months or less. I did not say that it would take 3 years or more. Rather, I said 2 to 3 years. It's necessary to meet with the stakeholders and the organizations that you mentioned at the outset. And secondly, we need to follow the correct process before the Senate and the House of Commons. I'd also like to mention something else. I'd like to underline, in fact, the fact that we have to hold these consultations. We have to garner the opinions of these various groups and organizations that you've already cited. That's absolutely essential before we actually draft and finalize these regulations. Yes, I think we all agree with that. I just mentioned two main organizations, but I'd like to underline something, Madam Minister. C13, the Modernized Official Languages Act, it's a real flagship historic act. It's a real first for your government. And this timeline of 2 to 3 years, as was shared by the organizations, is really not acceptable for them. That is why we're asking to try and reduce this timeline. So can the Minister confirm that her responsibilities under the Official Languages Act covers all of the Act and in particular Part 7?
Réponse, Madame Anand.
A short answer, Minister Anand. Mr. Quell, yes, very short. Yes, we have a responsibility for Part 7 on monitoring. Yes. Thank you. Moving on to Ms. Goodridge for 5 minutes. You have the floor, Ms. Goodridge.
Mr. Anand, for being here today at our committee. So after 8 long years of absolutely wasteful spending and in fact, a doubling of spending on outside consultants, what we have been seeing is the government continuing to spend more and more money on this. And in fact, someone in the government thought it was a good idea to spend $669,000 and change on a contract to give advice on how to save money on consultants. Do you think that's a wise use of taxpayer dollars?
Je n'étais pas la ministre.
I was not the minister on that file, and I am here to discuss official languages and my responsibilities in that sector. So if you have a question on official languages, I will happily answer it.
I ask this because it's clearly pertinent. One of the things that we have been seeing and has been brought up by a number of different stakeholders on C13 was the fact that there wasn't one central person in charge. They asked to have Treasury Board be the one central person, but effectively accountability has been spread so that every single minister has been responsible. Minister Boissonnault answered that pretty clearly in our meeting last week. And so we just continue to see this government pushing forward, doubling down on spreading accountability so that effectively no one is responsible. So who is responsible at the end of the day for official languages here in Canada?
I share the responsibilities with Minister Boissonnault, of course, as I said already. I am responsible for public services and public servants. That's 250,000 public servants across our country. And bilingual services, that's Part 4, Part 5, and Part 7 of the Official Languages Act. For Minister Boissonnault, as he already said, I think that he said when he was before you, he said that he needs to continue to support organizations in communities across our country in both official languages. Thank you. Yes, so we have a responsibility and we will work together. So you decided to not listen to the opinion of Francophone communities outside of Quebec who were very clear in asking for a central agency for official languages. And you decided instead of sharing the responsibility between the Minister of Official Languages and yourself. So when there are problems, Canadians don't know who to turn to. So once again, that's a problem. And I think that it's absolutely necessary for you to reply why you decided to ignore the request from the Francophone community. Answer: I understand that this committee studied the Act, supported the Act, and everyone in the House voted in favor of the Act. And I was appointed at the end of July in this year, so I am here to support both official languages, and I will do that every day with my department and my team as well. So if you were the minister at the time, would you have suggested a change in the division of responsibilities? We need to continue supporting and implementing C13, and we need to work together on that.
Very clear.
Nous devons travailler.
We need to work together.
I asked a very simple, very clear answer. I'm
30
going to
seconds.
ask it again in English. If you were the minister, would you have made it clear that there was only one person responsible for official languages in this country?
Comme
Yes
cette
or
committee,
no?
je pense que cette loi fonctionne.
I think this committee decided that this bill works very well for Canadians, and I will continue to implement it. 10 seconds.
Elle refuse de
She refuses to give an answer, so I will give my time to someone else. Thank you, Ms. Goodridge. And now we will move to the Liberals, and we will give the floor to Mr. Iachonu for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Minister, welcome. I hope that things are going well so far and that it's not too difficult. But I would like to turn... You talked about your experience of learning French at a young age. Can you tell us more about the importance of that experience and how we can make the country more bilingual? Answer: we have a country of many immigrants, and that was the case for my parents. They were immigrants. They come from India, and they are not with us anymore, and that's sad for me. But my father was the one, I don't know why, but he told me when I was young that I needed to learn French. That wasn't what he said with his language. He said it's essential to speak French. Point of order.
Oui, Madame.
Yes, Ms. Goodridge. A point of order. Thank you. I'm sorry. It's a point of order. The minister refused to reply to my questions, which were about her mandate at Treasury Board, because it didn't apply to the study, but now she's going to talk about her early childhood. How is that relevant? Madame Kayabaga. Mr. Chair, I think we need to give respect to the minister today to answer our questions. Our colleague has asked her questions, and the colleague on Zoom is interrupting to say what exactly he is entitled to ask questions. She is entitled to answer. Madame Kayabaga, let's turn back to Ms. Kayabaga. I would like to remind you that Mr. Iachonu did exactly the same thing earlier, so we cannot accuse on one hand and then do the same thing on the other side. Mr. Chair, you must let me speak when I ask a point of order as a member of the committee. And if I see that it's a debate, I will. Mr. Chair, I would come back to my point. We are, as members of the committee, we are allowed to speak, and you, as the chair, you must let me speak. But you were cutting me off, and I would like us to return to the fact that our colleague is asking questions, and he is expecting answers from the minister, and he is losing his time. So I would like us to turn back to our colleague who is asking questions of the minister. Madame Kaibaga, have you wrapped up your point of order? Yes, Mr. Iacono. Mr. Chair, one moment, please, because I'm a bit confused. I don't know whether the minister finished her response, and so I hope that you stopped the clock for me because, well, no, I'm not ready because I don't know where we're at. Well, I don't know whether the minister has finished or not. I'll ask her the question, and if she has finished answering my question, then I will continue. So then you cannot restart it if I don't know where we're at. Please resume your question, Mr. Iacono. Madam Minister, did you wrap up your first response to my question before being interrupted? Well, I would like to continue, but it's relevant to my work. I'm a minister who's Anglophone, who is from an immigrant background, and that's the reason why I can speak French. And it's important, too, because we have a country where there's a lot of diversity, and we need to have an environment where everyone can share information in both official languages. So thank you for the question. Do you have, in terms of investments, do you have enough funding for the implementation of C13? Yes. Perfect. Yes. Right now. Yes. And if we need more support, more financial support, I will request it. What investments have been made by the government in terms of language training of public servants? I can't give you exact numbers, but every department is responsible for ensuring that its public servants are trained in official languages. So, and the Treasury Board under Minister Anand, we plan to create a new framework for language training, which will include measures to help people from equity groups learn both official languages. We have a cross-cutting plan for all of government to ensure consistency, to ensure that each employee in the public service has the opportunity to receive language training that will allow them to rise in the ranks and reach management positions. How do you plan to increase the number of bilingual positions in Canada? What measures contributed to the increase of the number of bilingual positions in Canada? As I said, 96% of positions are bilingual now, which means that we have people in positions that have already met the conditions for bilingualism. So we must continue with that work, and that is the work that Karsten's team does every day. So you have the floor. Thank you. Yes, the public service currently has 42% of positions that are designated bilingual. So the government, 30 seconds, the government needs to strike a balance to allow unilingual francophones in Quebec and anglophones elsewhere to also have the opportunity to pursue a career within the public service, but that where necessary, of course, the positions are designated bilingual. And as the minister said, 96% of the people who are in bilingual positions meet the language requirements of their positions. Thank you, Mr. Iachino. And we will continue with a 2.5-minute round. And Mr. Beaulieu, you have the floor. Thank you. Madam Minister, the Treasury Board has a very important role within the federal government for the implementation of the Official Languages Act. And in the new legislation, one of the sections says that one of the objectives of the Act is to encourage the existence of a Francophone majority in Quebec. And so have you targeted measures to implement the Act, to address that section of the legislation? I will start and then give the floor to my colleague. First of all, we must continue to support Francophones outside of Quebec and within Quebec, and that means that the necessary support with immigration. I know that my colleague, Minister Miller, is working on that, and he also delivered the immigration plan, and he works with the province of Quebec on that. Furthermore, there are situations in which OLMCs in Quebec need to have the necessary support for their language as well, and we are continuing to provide the necessary support. Have there been discussions to establish which measures will support French in Quebec? And when you spoke about OLMCs, but Quebec is also a minority within Canada. It is part of the language minority in North America. Are discussions ongoing? Do you plan to monitor the situation to ensure that there are truly measures to protect French? 15 seconds. Mr. Quell, you can respond as well if you wish. All services in Quebec are offered in French as well. So we are in a situation in which there are services. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ms. Minister Anand. And now it is Ms. Ashton's turn for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. I wanted to add a comment that I appreciate the personal story that Madam Minister shared. I am also the daughter of immigrants that came to Canada who didn't speak French, and they insisted that I and my brother learned French in French immersion because it was one of the 2 official languages in our country. But what I would say is that recognizing that now in 2023, French is in decline, that highlights the importance of applying C-13 as quickly as possible and the implementation of the responsibilities of the Treasury Board. So it is with that context in mind that I hope that the Treasury Board will move more quickly than the 2 to 3 years that were suggested at the Senate committee previously. My question that I would like to ask is that we know that all federal institutions must comply with the Act, particularly Part 7, which deals with positive measures to ensure the development of OLMCs. Do you intend to define the term positive measures in Part 7? The work on the regulations will continue to ensure that the Act is more precise. So, of course, we will do so. But my responsibility is to guide the federal institutions by providing them policies and directives so that they comply with all provisions of the Act. So I will continue to be a minister that says daily, yes, that is urgent. 15 seconds for the process. So if we can action this process more quickly, I will do so. Thank you, Madam Ashton. That's your 2.5 minutes. So a quick round for the Conservatives and the Liberals. We'll start with 2 minutes. Mr. Dalton.
On your appointment, and I know that you were put there to help put an end maybe to some of the waste that's going on in government, and I would say maybe that's in the appearance of something happening. And the reason why is because just the economic update has increased, the budget has increased by $10 billion in the past 1 year, and one of your roles is to cut down $3 billion a year. So it's, do you not see it as ironic that KPMG was consulted with $767 of taxpayers' money to figure out how to reduce consultants? Just give a simple yes or no. It's relevant.
Ce n'était pas une.
It wasn't a contract. It wasn't an issue for me as president of the Treasury Board on the spending review rather. The Minister of Natural Resources decided to issue that contract in 2022.
No. Okay. Yeah, so the government has, in the past year alone, has spent 16...
Point of order, please. Point of order, Mr. Lauzon. Yes, Mr. Lauzon, unfortunately, we haven't done a sound test with you. And by respect for the full respect for the procedure, can you pass your point of order to someone else other than you, because we cannot accept a communication where there have been no sound tests? Yes, I can do this. Yes, Mr. Sanson. I'm sorry about that, Mr. Lauzon. With full respect, Mr. Dalton, your questions today have to be geared towards official languages. And I don't want the Conservatives to lose time and not be able to get answers on such an important issue as official languages. Let's not talk about the government's investments. Chair, if you want to continue.
$16.7 billion has been spent in consultants in the last year alone. How much money has been spent on consultants for official languages? And the reason I say this is because there is an action plan has $30.5 million to be spent on economic development on the official languages. And groups have been telling us that they have seen no funding yet. What they do see is the government is year-to-year spending is expanding by billions of dollars.
Dalton,
how much is being spent on consulting on official languages?
Merci beaucoup.
Mr. Dalton, you've run out of time. Would you like to add? Madam Anand, and then there'll be 2 minutes from Ms. Kaya Baga. It's up to you. Ms. Kaya Baga, I'm chairing the committee, and I simply said to Madam Anand that she can answer. But if you have questions, it's over to you, of course. Well, it is my time, so thank you for my 2 minutes. I don't want to lose it on this. Thank you very much for coming, Madam Minister. President of the Treasury Board. We've talked a great deal about French speakers outside of Quebec and the importance of immigration in the Francophone world outside of Quebec. What do you think about Francophone immigration to Canada outside of Quebec? Can you support this point to make sure that we can meet our immigration threshold targets for Francophone immigrations is so important for us each year? That, of course, is a good question. It's very important. I travelled through Alberta last month, and I heard from public servants, Francophone public servants, and I heard about their experience. They want to have a public service environment where it's possible for them to actually speak French. So I want to support immigration, of course, throughout our country and support people who can then speak French. Thank you. I appreciate that. We know that 60% of the Francophone pool in the whole world is found in Africa. What do you think about supporting immigration of French-speaking Africans, in particular French-speaking students? 30 seconds for an answer. That is the responsibility of Minister Miller, of course, but I very much support the levels that he's presented, and he already delivered on this last week. And I will continue to support the French language and immigration with French speakers also. Is there something else that you'd like to share with the committee on your role as regards French speakers in Canada outside of Quebec? Ms. Anand, thank you very much. And perhaps you can transfer this information to my colleague. Unfortunately, 2 minutes is up. So thank you very much, dear witnesses, for having participated in this panel of our committee. And we're going to suspend so that we can have a sound test with Mr. Lauzon and to allow the second panel to come in. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to all of you.
Bonjour, Monsieur Lauzon.
Mr. Lauzon.
Fier.
So we are going to start with the second part of our 75th meeting. And now I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We have Ms. Catherine Tait, who is President and CEO of CBC Radio Canada. Thank you for being with us today. And also Mr. Marco Dubé, who is Chief Transformation Officer and Executive VP for People and Culture. So welcome to both of you. And to start, Ms. Tait will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and then we'll go on to our round of questions. So over to you, Madam Tait. Thank you very much. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for this invitation to meet with you today. As you can see, I have with me Marco Dubé, Chief Transformation Officer and Executive Vice President, People and Culture. He is the champion of official languages at CBC Radio Canada. I want it to be quite clear that CBC Radio Canada is proud of the phenomenal work that's carried out by its teams to serve Canadians in English and in French in every corner of this country. We know how much people depend on us, particularly in minority language communities, where we are one of the few media broadcasting companies in the French language. Bless you. We take our commitment seriously, particularly our ability to support the health and vitality of the French language every day right across the country. Our organisation also encourages our employees to express themselves in either French or English. And our documents are shared in both languages, and we encourage our staff to learn the other official language. I would not want one unfortunate incident to take away from these facts. This committee has invited me here to discuss the media reporting about one of our English language podcasts that was adapted into French and Spanish. I understand how that reporting caused this committee concern. I want to assure you that what has been reported does not accurately reflect our values as an organisation, nor our commitment to support official languages, nor our day-to-day practice when it comes to adapting content into other languages. CBC and Radio Canada each offer hundreds of podcasts to our Canadian listeners. Some are created by us and has adapted 3 podcasts that are very popular that have been adapted either by studios in Quebec using actors who are members of the UD, Union des Artistes, or by Radio Canada itself. In the case of the podcast Alone, a Love Story, CBC was approached by Studio Ochenta that wanted to adapt Alone into French and Spanish. The responsible team in CBC did not turn to the expertise that already exists in Canada. That was a mistake. And afterwards, there was an unfortunate, hurtful comment that was made in a media interview regarding the Québécois accent. This was unacceptable, and it does not reflect our position. And we absolutely admit this, and we offer our sincere apologies. We are fortunate enough here in Canada to have an unparalleled dubbing industry that works with very talented actors, and we often use their services both for podcasts and for television programs, and that is what we should have done in this particular case. We are clarifying our practices to prevent this type of error from happening again. We have therefore withdrawn the French version, and we will retranslate these episodes, and Radio Canada will be in charge of this adaptation. When I learned about this incident, I immediately called and wrote to Tania Kotoyani, who's the president of the Union des Artistes, in order to offer our apologies. and she kindly accepted my apology. I'm aware that this committee had invited 2 of our employees to take questions from members on this file. As President and CEO, I am responsible before Parliament for the activities of the public broadcaster.
We correct them, but all of our employees must be confident that their work is shielded from external interference. Nous avons tous la responsabilité de protéger.
All of us have a responsibility to protect the independence of Canada's public broadcaster, and I welcome the committee's support in this effort. I want you to know that our commitment to the health and vitality of the French language remains steadfast. It's unshakable. It is vital to our mandate to serve the whole of the Canadian population, and that commitment will not change. If you would like to round off, and thus I welcome your questions now. Thank you very much, Ms. Tate. Before we kick off the round of questions, in your presentation a few moments ago, you referred to the correspondence that you had with the committee. The fact that we're hearing from you today does not, in fact, eliminate the invitation to the other members, and we do not want to interfere in the content or programming or creativity and innovation of your organisation. We accept your presence here today, but the rest of the motion has not been excluded for future meetings. So having said that, we will kick off our round of questions, and we'll start with Mr. Bernard Généreux from the Conservative Party of Canada for 6 minutes. You have the floor, sir. Thank you very much, and Ms. Tate and Mr. Dubé, welcome. And thank you for being here with us today. Of course, you are aware of the motion that I submitted to the committee. I hope you don't have any problem with my accent today, I hope. Great. So, Ms. Tate, could you please explain to me how in an organisation that's as important as CBC Radio-Canada, which is principally funded from the public purse, how could there have been such a lack of respect towards the Quebec francophone and francophone population outside of Quebec? How could this have happened within your organisation? And of course, I'm also inferring that in this type of institution where you're the president and CEO, do you not have certain firewalls that could have prevented this type of incident from taking place? If you allow me to do so, I think it's important to know that CBC Radio-Canada and the teams of CBC Radio-Canada produce hundreds of programs each year. In fact, each month, thousands of programming hours are produced in both official languages and also in 8 Indigenous languages. And in this case here, a mistake was made. But I'm talking about thousands of hours of programming that take place. As I said earlier, I do hope that one unfortunate incident such as this one, which is of course regrettable, but I do hope that that doesn't cast doubt on all of the work that we achieve. You have to recall that we've got 2 teams, the English-speaking and the French-speaking teams. There's over 3,000 on each side, and we work together on a daily basis, and we produce an enormous amount of programs. And I would dare to proffer that we are one of the most bilingual crown corporations within the federal family. I would like to know something, Ms. Tate. This incident took place, and you've said that you do internal translation work in Radio-Canada, but you also turn to the outside world as well. So how many podcasts, videos, and other programs could or have been translated by French teams from France rather than Quebec teams? And if that was the case, are there calls for tenders which would allow you to decide whether you turn to a team from France or from Quebec who are French speakers? First of all, we have several podcasts on the English-speaking side that are adapted rather than translated. We say adapted into French by Radio-Canada teams, either internally or with the help of Quebec External Studios. And we've never worked with agencies or companies based in Paris or elsewhere in France. In this case here, the employee received a proposal for the translation into French and Spanish. It's an agency that specialized in producing podcasts in several languages. So he was responding to a proposal that he'd received. We do not have any other examples like that. So I'm talking about this person's reflex, and that's why we want to hear from the two other witnesses that we've called. And Mr. Bisnall said we don't want to interfere in the daily running of their work. But what led to that decision being taken by that person who works within your organization? How come he made this sort of decision? It seemed to be his knee-jerk reaction, his reflex. And this knee-jerk reaction, is it something that could possibly happen again? I'm putting a fundamental question here. And you referred to what was said about this afterwards, about avoiding a Québécois accent. Well, I'm going to try and control myself and remain polite here, but it really is very insulting, not just for the committee here and for the Québécois French language and the Canadians, in particular for Québécois artists. So I hope that this will never happen again. It really is an insult to the Quebec nation as a whole. Really is.
I agree, and that is why I immediately called the president of the UDA in Quebec to offer my apology. I completely agree with you on the comments. I repeat my question, 30 seconds. Fundamentally, are the internal firewalls established to ensure that this type of thing doesn't happen again in the future? Marco, would you like to field that question? Yes. Yes, absolutely. It was a mistake. It was a singular case. We corrected the situation. We are here to assume our responsibility, and we reviewed the processes on that team to ensure it never happens again. So if Mr. Généreux, I'm sure your question was relevant, but unfortunately, your time is over. And now we will move to Mr. Seri from the Liberal Party of Canada. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Madame Tate and Mr. Dubé for joining us. And thank you for your clear comments. You responded directly to the motion. You spoke to the union in Quebec. You apologized. You said that it was completely unacceptable. We all agree on that. And you indicated that you have taken measures to ensure that it doesn't happen again. So I think that you're responding clearly to the motion that was tabled here. Now, my question here, that in an article that appeared yesterday in Radio-Canada, they talked about a concern about the quality of journalism in Canada versus because there is some significant pressure here. What can the federal government do to strengthen journalism and the quality of journalism in our OLMCs? I come from Ontario. I'm very proud of CBC, but if we look across the country, what can we do more to strengthen the quality of journalism here in our country? Well, I could talk about this for hours. Well, I will start with our practices and our journalistic standards, which are at the heart of everything that we do in journalism to ensure of nearly unparalleled quality around the world. That is at the heart of what we do. So at the end of the day, journalists are the ones who do the work. We aren't the ones. It's not Marco and me. It's the journalists. So if you want to know what we can do to improve or strengthen journalism, especially in OLMCs, it is to better fund your public broadcaster, because we know that as soon as there is presence, as soon as we are on the ground, we have an impact. It's the proximity of the public broadcaster that is where we really win people's trust. That is how it's the presence in the regions that makes the big difference. Thank you for mentioning that about funding, because it's very concerning as an Ontarian that there is a leader of the Conservative Party of Canada who's going around Canada and saying that he is going to nearly fully cut funding to CBC in meetings across the country. So we're very concerned about Radio-Canada across the country. Can you tell us, if the Conservative Party came to power and drastically cut funding on CBC, what impact would that have on Radio-Canada? Would Radio-Canada still be able to offer services that they offer currently in Ontario and across the country? I had the pleasure of giving a speech to the Montreal Chamber of Commerce yesterday, and that is exactly the subject that I raised. Imagine a world without Radio-Canada. And what I can tell you is that without Radio-Canada, without CBC, there is a loss of talent, culture, democracy, connection from one ocean to the other. And for me, it's something. So we are trying to fight disinformation and polarization in our society, and that is exactly what we need to do. We need to protect our public broadcaster, which is very precious for Canadian society, both Francophone and Anglophone. How many jobs would be lost on the network if the funding were cut? How would Radio-Canada offer services? Well, that's exactly it. You are at the heart of the matter, because people think that. Point of order, Mr. Chair. Excuse me, Ms. Tate. Mr. Généreux. Mr. Chair, we were criticized by our colleagues that we were asking questions that were not related to the issue at hand. I don't know how Mr. Serré's question referring to our leader or potential cuts. Well, that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about a situation that arose with a podcast. So we are absolutely not talking about cuts, and there's no question of that. Mr. Généreux, thank you. Are there any other comments? Mr. Serré, is it possible for you to tie your question to today's topic? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, yes, there is a link, because when we talk about resources, and you talked about podcasts across the country, it's clear that if CBC is cut, how will we be able to continue to offer services in French through Radio-Canada across the country and in Ontario if the funding is not in place? CBC and Radio-Canada are interlinked. We share technology. They share operational support. We are in the same offices. We are in the same stations. We work together. We share equipment and even content sometimes, especially for the war in Ukraine or the war in Israel and Gaza. So you're entirely right. As soon as there is a cut on one side, the other side is very affected as well. Will Radio-Canada have to cease its operations? Point of order. Yes, Ms. Goodridge. And then I imagine I know where you're going with this, but I will give you the floor. Ms. Goodridge. Thank you. Our motion and what we are studying today deals with podcasts at CBC and Radio-Canada, and not with journalistic access of Francophones. So I would ask that questions from the Liberal Party in particular focus on that subject. Thank you, Ms. Goodridge. And I think that Ms. Goodridge raises a good point that was discussed earlier during the first hour, and we fell into line. So I would ask Mr. Serré to do the same. Otherwise, I will be required to take the floor from him. If CBC Radio-Canada lost funding, how many podcasts would we lose? Well, I can't say. There would be a drop of our services, of course. So we know very well that particularly the services that are not profitable, for example, rural markets or... Thank you, Ms. Tate. And your time is up, Mr. Serré. Thank you. And now we give the floor to Mr. Beaulieu for 6 minutes. Yes. On the one hand, you apologized for the issue with translation and using a French firm to avoid the Québécois accent. But the people who made that decision, did you identify them? Were measures taken? Yes, of course, they are aware. They have understood their error, and they understand that a process needs to be followed and practices need to be followed. Often when we listen to CBC, well, you get the impression that you're only reflecting the point of view, for example, of Anglophone groups on Bill 21, Bill 96. Do you think that you should also represent the point of view of organizations that defend French, because it seems like you should give more objective information? Well, as I said earlier, we have standard journalism standards and practices, and the fundamental principle of that is impartiality. Ms. Tate, silence in the room, please. I asked for the others to keep silence while you had the floor. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking to me. Point of order, Mr. Chair. I think that the question is interpreting something that was not said, that was not really... Mr. Beaulieu and Mr. Sanson. Well, I'm just saying that I think he's making an interpretation and is using that in his question that's not exactly the subject of discussion. Mr. Beaulieu, please, we're talking about an example where there was disdain for the Quebec accent, and quite frequently these advocacy groups vehicle what we call Quebec bashing. Or if I can give an example that dates back when there was an attack against Pauline Marois, that was reflected. But I'm thinking, for example, of a journalist who said, well, I'll give you concrete examples. The journalist was talking about George Floyd in the United States. And then the journalist Robin Urback said that anti-Black racism is less apparent in Canada, but it needs to be denounced. And then she talked about Quebec and saying that racism is embedded in Bill 21. It's anti-Muslim. And she said there's a long history of anti-Black racism in Quebec and Montreal. And xenophobia is deeply rooted and it goes back in its history. I'm not saying Quebec isn't racist, but it isn't more racist than anywhere else. And when journalists disseminate information like that, I think it's really biased. If I may respond, if a member of this committee or a member of the public has a comment on our journalistic content, we have an ombudsman that responds to those comments. I I want committee members to understand it's not CBC management that gets involved in journalism, and not the government either. And it's particularly not politicians. We have an independent system to protect the impartiality, the exactness, the balance, the fairness, and the integrity of journalism at CBC Radio-Canada. And the Ombudsman, Mr. Champoux, is there to address questions. You did not answer my question. You referred me to the Ombudsman. That's great that there are mechanisms in place. But what I think is that in this case, the journalist was clearly biased. And if we can make that observation, Mr. Chair, journalism always has a context. And if we need to look at the context of a series of articles to properly understand. So if there is a case like the one Mr. Beaulieu is raising, then that needs to be presented to our Ombudsman. For example, during the last leaders' debate, there was a lot of talk about that. And the moderator how do you legitimize Bill 21 and talk about racism and Bill 96 when these questions were those questions were authorized by members of the council? Point of order, Mr. Chair. Yes, we'll start with Mr. Serré. Two things. How much time does he have left? And, well, I think you're going a bit far, Mr. Beaulieu. I think that, well, Mr. Beaulieu, the point of order is made by Mr. Serré, and then there's Mr. Lauzon. Did you wrap up, Mr. Serré? Mr. Lauzon, you have the floor for a point of order. Thank you, Mr. Chair. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. On 2 occasions, you asked us to come back to the subject at hand, which is the motion tabled by the Conservatives. This is a leaders' debate of Bill 96. That's very far off target. If it is possible to apply what you said earlier to certain committee members, we came back on track. Now, it's time for Mr. Beaulieu to do the same. Point of order by Mr. Iacono. Yes, we're also talking about racism a number of times. I don't think the motion deals with racism in any way, and I think the witness responded very well to what the public can do if they're not happy about what is being offered. They can contact the Ombudsman. I would ask Mr. Beaulieu to direct his questions to the motion at hand. Well, the link is very easy to establish. The subject of the current motion talks about a disdain for Quebec, for the Quebec accent. And in all of the examples that I gave, it reflects the same thing. And so I don't think that state radio and television should reflect content like that. In the leaders' debate, for example, you admit that it was an error that was made. Was there a question? I'm sorry, I missed the question. Earlier, when before my colleagues across the way had their diversions, when during the leaders' debate we understood that there was a disdain for Quebec about the charter of the French language, and they refused to apologize, even if the content, Mr. Beaulieu, even if they made a mistake. Mr. Beaulieu, your time is up. If you wish to respond, Ms. Tate, Mr. Chair, allow me to finish with Ms. Tate, and then we will do a point of order subsequently. If you have anything to add to the question, please do so, and if not, we will move on. Inaudible for the interpreter. And now we will move to Ms. Ashton for 6 minutes. Ms. Ashton, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and welcome to Madam President. First of all, why was the decision to hire the Parisian studio made without taking into account Quebec expertise? As I explained, I'm sorry, I don't... Is there... Oh, there she is. Okay. As I explained earlier, it was a response to a proposal by a European company which specializes in podcasts in multiple languages, 20 or so languages. And in that case, the employee responded to this pitch, and that was the mistake. They should have hired a Quebec company. How do you intend to ensure that this doesn't happen again and that Quebec expertise is valued? Well, first of all, we discussed with all employees on our podcast teams, and we withdrew the podcast that was made by the European company, and we are redoing the podcast, and Radio-Canada is in charge of the adaptation. So all of the team members on the podcast team have clearly understood the error that was made, and that is why I am absolutely convinced that this type of situation will not arise again in the future.
For Northern Manitoba, as you know, we have been without a sustained local CBC presence for a number of years, only some brief stints. And despite CBC's contractual obligation to maintain local involvement, CBC involvement here, we haven't seen that. Should we be concerned, given this latest development, the podcast that was being punted to Paris, that CBC Radio-Canada is not taking regional programming and respecting our regions, whether it's the entirety of Quebec or regions like Northern Manitoba when it comes to its regional programming?
Monsieur le Président, I can say that with respect to regional programming, never before has proximity. J'ai parlé de la proximité.
I talked about proximity and relevance and inclusion. They're part of our next strategy.
Of polarization and of disinformation, our regional presence is absolutely critical. I do need to correct the record, though, on the contractual nature of our obligation. We do what we can with the resources that we have. There are 33 communities in English Canada of population more than 50,000 that do not have a presence of CBC. On the French side, there are 5 communities with populations of over 50,000 that do not have a Radio-Canada presence. And we know that presence builds confidence, it builds trust, and it builds a more civic and civil society. And that is why I argue each and every day to have a greater presence in our regions, to go deeper, and to be absolutely more involved in all of our communities. This is our commitment and our absolute mandate and desire.
Well, we certainly hope to see that come to fruition here in Northern Manitoba and obviously in other communities. Retournons à la capacité francophone.
So let's go back to the francophone capacity in Radio-Canada. How many members of senior management of CBC are specifically French speakers and participate actively in decision-making when it comes to the content in French, in particular when it's related to the Quebec accent? Would you like to field that one? Yes. Chair. So for the senior management team, there are 8 people, including the president, involved, and the majority are francophone. The senior management team continually works in English and French in all of its meetings, and it's quite obvious that we take the decisions to manage the corporation. And we always want to strike the right balance between English and French throughout the organization. Half of our workforce is French-speaking, the other half is English-speaking. So we have a very fair distribution there. 30 seconds, Ms. Ashton. Yes, we would like to have more exact numbers if you could provide these figures to us via letter in writing. We'd really appreciate that. So to make it more specific, is the question on the senior management or the management level in general? That's what I didn't quite grasp. My question was senior management that participate in decisions that are taken about French content, including decisions related to the Quebecois accent. Thank you very much, Ms. Ashton. Your 6 minutes are up. Yes, if you've got information and data that you can provide to us to allow the committee to have more information, just send that in to the clerk, please. Thank you. So now we'll start with our second round of questions. First of all, we'll welcome Mr. Berthold from the Conservative Party of Canada, who is not a regular attendee of a regular member, but he's with us today, and you have 5 minutes, sir. Yes, I go from one committee to the other. So the last time, Ms. Tate, we confirmed that you don't have any problem with my accent in French, so that's already settled. In your letter of apology to the UD about the podcast that was translated in French, you said CBC wanted to have international outreach and asked a Parisian company to carry out dubbing. The Quebecois accent apparently disturbed certain employees in CBC, and in particular Mr. Cécile Fernandez, apparently. So why are you referring to Ms. Emily Barazizon, Cécile Fernandez? Why are you not wanting them to come and explain this bad decision themselves before the committee? I shoulder the responsibility for all employees of CBC Radio-Canada. So if a mistake was made, it is my responsibility, and so I'm shouldering that responsibility. Sorry, but it's not up to you to decide who is actually called before a parliamentary committee. It's not up to you to decide that parliamentarians should not hear from the person who took that particular decision, a very bad decision in passing. The last time in your comments, you cite, and I cite here, that you were concerned the parliamentary power of a committee could be used to force employees in terms of taking their daily matters. So translating a podcast in France rather than Quebec, is that interfering with their journalistic decisions? If I could refer now to the Broadcasting Act, it's very clear, and it's very clearly underlined there, that we are independent, not just in terms of journalistic content, but also in terms of programming decisions. That is why I think that in this case, the interest... What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of to prevent Mr. Cécile Fernandez, who is the executive producer of CBC Podcast, and Ms. Emily Barazizon, who is head of marketing public relations for the radio and audio side of things? Why do you not want them to testify? What are you so afraid of? Are you afraid that CBC is beyond the reach of the legislators? The Parliament has the right to summon any person to testify before us, and this power goes far beyond the Broadcasting Act that you've just cited. So why, as President and CEO, you're preventing the Canadian public from knowing why these people took these bad decisions with the Canadians' public funds? We have clearly stated that this was a mistake, and it is my role as President CEO to present our apologies. We've done that. It's not just apologies. I want to understand the why. Where does this contempt come from for this Quebecois accent that was expressed by Mr. Fernandez? Where does this disdain come from? He's the only one who can come and actually explain why he chose this and thought it was a good idea to pay a French-based company to translate into French a podcast because the Quebec accent doesn't really cut it. And you cannot answer that question? Ms. Tate, I think you're showing a lack of respect towards this committee and towards the Parliament when you're refusing to allow these two people to testify before us. I'm very sorry, but that really is not the case. I have the utmost respect for this process. I had understood that it was my responsibility to come before you, to come before this committee, because when we're referring to independence and CBC Radio-Canada interruption, I understand you've already said this. You've already said this in your presentation. No, I don't want you to do that. Thank you very much, Ms. Tate. No, I've finished. You don't want these people to testify before us. I'll give the rest of my time to Ms. Goodrich, if you allow me to do so, Mr. Chair. So, Ms. Goodrich, you have 1 minute. Thank you very much. So very quickly, after 8 years of Liberal government and the carbon tax, it's attacking rural Canada. Sorry, point of order. With the utmost respect, this question, Mr. Sanson, you have the floor for a point of order. Thank you very much, Chair. With all the respect that I owe you, this question really is not at all related to this. The carbon tax or the tax on pollution being raised today, it does not relate to the motion to invite our witnesses here today. This is not appropriate. It's not aligned with the matter at hand today. Thank you very much, Mr. Sanson. Ms. Goodrich, would you like to comment and please refocus the debate on the subject matter at hand, or if you have a notice of motion, you can make that. Yes, I have a notice of motion that I have the right to present. Small francophone communities really are essential when it comes to the traditional or bilingual tradition of our country, but the increase in the cost of living and basic products such as heating, food and transport because of the reckless policy of this government, which is making it hard for people to survive. And so the notice of motion therefore says that the committee should undertake a study with 5 meetings to examine the impact of the carbon tax on rural communities of the official language minority communities in Canada. The interpreters did not receive this motion.
Undertake a 5-meeting study to examine the impact of the carbon tax on rural official language communities across Canada. J'en ai la motion en les deux langues.
I have the motion in the 2 languages, and that can be circulated to the committee. So, Ms. Goodrich, the clerk has received this notice of motion, and it will be distributed forthwith to all the members.
Alors, est-ce que tous les membres ont reçu?
So have all the members received the notice of motion that's just been submitted by Ms. Goodrich? Unfortunately, the interpreters have not received it. So, point of order, Chair, I'd like to understand something.
Oui, Monsieur Serré, excusez-moi.
Yes, Siri, I was having a discussion with the clerk. Yes, no problem. I want to understand. The time is up for this question. There's been a notice of motion that's been circulated. So I'd like to ask you, Chair and Clerk, can we go on to the next questions? Well, there's 30 seconds that are left. No, there's not 30 seconds left is the answer. Well, that's what we've got on our clock here at the front. So, Ms. Goodrich, would you like to end off 30 seconds? Thank you very much, Chair. I think it's really essential that we should take time in this committee to really examine the impact of the carbon tax on rural communities, where there are official language minorities communities, because it's essential. Culture is part of our life. Point of order. Mr. Yokano, I'd like to make a comment first, if you allow me to do so. Ms. Goodrich, her 5 minutes are up, and you have to understand that the time that was used for submitting the notice of motion was actually withdrawn from her overall time allocation. So she just finished off her question. So would you like to add something, Mr. Yokano? I'd like to understand why the carbon tax actually has an impact on language. Well, Mr. Yokano, At the moment, we are just accepting this notice of motion, and we can debate this under committee business in another meeting. That's what I've understood. Inaudible? Yes, all that can be discussed. But for the moment, you'll understand that we're all listening to the testimony from the President CEO of CBC Radio-Canada for the moment. So now we'll go on to Mr. Lauzon for 5 minutes, please.
Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to thank Madam Tate and Mr. Dubé for being with us today. And I'd also like to thank you for having admitted that an error was made. That's a very important step. And thank you also for having quickly reacted. You acted very quickly, you and your team. And thank you for being the representative of CBC Radio-Canada and to come before the committee to field our questions. I'd like to know a bit more before I start my actual questions. First of all, I'd like to know which process you have set up to remedy this situation. So what kind of process have you established to ensure that today in this committee we can put in our record that this situation will never happen again? Now, without going into all of the details, you're independent in your management and your decision-making powers, but we would just like to understand how you have made certain changes to make sure that this does not happen again. And so thank you for that question. I'll turn to my colleague to answer this one. Chair, the change that we've made is basically that we've met with the teams and done awareness raising with the teams. They're now very much aware of the mistake that was made and the impact of this on all of us. So we have set up measures to ensure that when CBC teams must and want to have an interpretation or a translation of a podcast into the French language, then obviously the process is that they have to turn to companies based in Quebec. I would say also that we have beefed up discussions between the Radio-Canada and CBC teams when it comes to these sensitive issues such as this one. And we're quite confident that with these measures, we'll be able to make sure that this type of incident, which was a one-off incident, will not occur again. Well, you've talked a bit about this one-off incident. Do you have an example in case law, or can you cite a moment when a similar event has happened, and when did that happen? Or is it really a one-off event? Yes, it is a one-off event, one of a kind. No, and this is a question in particular for Madame Tate. How were your apologies received and the communications with Union des Artistes, the UDA? Can you talk about their reaction, first of all, and then afterwards, can you explain how they reacted after you intervened and presented an apology and explained the situation and explained that there had been a failing within your teams internally? As I explained, I called up Ms. Contagnani, who's the president of the UDA. I called her immediately when I heard about this incident and when I offered my apologies. Without any explanation or justification, I said, this is a mistake and we will correct it, quite simply. She was very kind in her response. She told me that she appreciated my call. I also sent her a letter afterwards so that she could share this with her members. And Marco also called up the unions at Radio-Canada. I was very happy that Ms. Contagnani actually told the media that she accepted her apologies. 30 seconds. Just I want to talk about the unions. Personally speaking, have you been able to speak with the unions to explain this situation, or was this done internally within the UDA with their president? No, I talked to the UDA, but Marco talked the STTRC and the other union. Perhaps you can add to this. The Association of Producers, Association des Réalisateurs, because employees are on one hand, there's the UDA, and then we've got our employee unions on the other hand. They're two separate entities. Thank you very much, Mr. Lauzon. Your 5 minutes is up. You kind of overflowed a little bit because I was rather negligent, so you were able to benefit from that. So let's go on to the last round, 2 minutes 30, and we'll start with Mr. Beaulieu from the Bloc Québécois. Well, thank you very much. Well, on the 13th of October, he admitted that a mistake had been made and so on and so forth. Now, you've said it's a one-off incident. It's not at all representative. You don't have any problems within your corporate culture, etc. Not at all. And then the different examples that I've cited, they're all one-off cases as well. They were talking about journalism. It's not the same sort of case here. When I was talking about journalism, as I've said, we have a process to guarantee that there's a response from our ombudsman if mistakes are made in terms of journalistic practice. That's something different. So when we're talking about journalism and journalists, what are your requirements? Do you require that they should avoid actually presenting certain prejudices? As I've said, we have journalistic standards and practices which are very, very clear on all of this. It has to be balanced, has to be impartial. That really is at the heart of all of this. So, of course, prejudices and so on, tails off. So your reports should reflect all viewpoints. When we're talking about Quebec, it should cover all these. Point of order, please.
Mr. Beaulieu, 1 moment, please. Mr. Lauzon. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to use my expression again. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. The motion is very clear and very simple. These are debates that are offside about, and I would like you to apply the rules and come back to the issue at hand. Thank you, Mr. Lauzon. For your information, Ms. Tate's testimony is... Okay, Mr. Beaulieu, I have a point of order now. It's very clear. Nothing can prevent us from speaking, even if it's a tenuous link to the subject at hand. So I think that the link that was drawn was quite clear. So I think that these points of order are a bit ridiculous. I'd come back to Mr. Beaulieu, just I'd like to restart your time. I'd just like to tell you that I would invite you to make the link. In translation in general, do you also hire people who have a Quebec or an Acadian accent? Yes. That's good. Well, and you're going to ensure that nothing like that happens again, but if there is another case, you would refer us to the ombudsman, or if we feel that the columnists or have prejudices and you don't agree with that and you send it to the ombudsman. Well, I'll repeat myself. We have journalistic standards that we follow. In the example that we're dealing with today, you don't think there was any disdain in it? That you, as I said, it was a lack of judgment in one staff member. That is all. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you, Ms. Tate. We will wrap up the round with Ms. Ashton for 2.5 minutes. You have the floor, Ms. Ashton. We heard that you intended to produce this podcast in Quebec French. When exactly do you intend to do so? It's already underway. We spoke with the audio team from Radio-Canada, and they're taking that on. It will still take a few months because they need to hire actors, but the new version will be online by next summer. Thank you for that. We are eager to hear it and share it, of course.
About CBC's role in contracting out, which is a concerning trend on various fronts. We are aware as well that the CBC confirmed that it hired the Hive, an advertising agency, for its 2024 Olympic campaign in partnership with the Canadian Olympic Committee. The Hive is a member of which locked out its own employees when it refused to sign ACTRA's national commercial agreement. I'm curious why the CBC is so keen on contracting out, and in this instance, to hire a company that supports anti-union practices.
Mr. Chair, I should just say that I have a hearing disability, so it's extremely hard for me to focus on a question that's being addressed to me when people are talking at the same time. So if you wouldn't mind, it would make it much easier. So I think the question was regarding the Hive, which is an advertising agency that was hired by...
Je vous arrête, Madame Tate.
I'll stop you, Ms. Tent. Well, the comment is very relevant, and it addresses to all members. I reminded you earlier, and that's why I wear the earpiece at all times, even in French. It allows me to understand better, but I understand completely your situation. I experience it myself, and I have my insurance policy in my ear. I'm sorry. No, it's fine. So please go ahead, Ms. Tate.
To the member, we were not the company that hired the Hive. It was the Canadian Olympics Committee that made the hire. We are working with COC this time. This is a first, by the way, that we work with them. But just to be clear, the Hive is one of many people or companies that responded to the RFP, all of which had the same issue that ACTRA has raised. And so there was really, my understanding is there was really no other choice among those that were, that presented themselves, as this is a generalized issue among the advertising business right now. But just to be clear, CBC has not contracted with this company. This is with the COC.
Merci, Madame Tate, et merci, Madame.
Thank you, Ms. Tate, and thank you, Ms. Ashton. That concludes that round of questioning. I would like to thank our witnesses, Mr. Dubé and Ms. Tate, for joining us today. And there will certainly be a follow-up by our committee following the motion tabled. And I would like to thank all committee members. Thank you for your indulgence. And I would inform you that at the next meeting, we will continue with the draft report on the study on increasing Francophone immigration to Canada. Does the committee wish to adjourn the meeting?